Welcome back to Sunday evening devotions. Well, tonight we want to look at the end of 2 Samuel, particularly 2 Samuel 21 through 24. We have a series of events that happens here as we near the end of David's reign. The first is that there was a famine that affected the land of Israel for some 3 years. And in that time, as the famine went on, David inquired of the Lord as to the reason for this famine and difficulty. And as he inquired of the Lord revealed to David through his prophet that it was because of the sin of Saul. Saul, in his zeal for the nationalism of Israel, had urged the people to destroy the Gibeonites, the natives of Gibeah who lived in the land of Israel back before and when Joshua conquered the land. Joshua had promised by the Lord's name that they would be protected by Israel. And so this was a sin not only against the Gibeonites, but it was a sin against the Lord. And God was angry for this break of trust. Well, death required death. And so David then chose 7, a perfect number, 7 descendants of Saul to bear the punishment for all of Israel. And they were to be hanged and displayed as those who were cursed because of the plague, that the plague might be averted. Rizpah, Saul's living wife, honored the dead by keeping the wild animals away from the bodies who were exposed, and this was noted by David. And so when the famine was stopped, then and rains came, the bodies were then buried, and David also gathered up the bones of Saul and Jonathan and his other sons, and they were all buried together in the family plot in the tribe of Benjamin. And so finally, the house of Saul, the lamp of Saul, is put out. The Philistines then become again enraged against Israel and attack. And what we find is that they are led by the family of Goliath. Now you may remember that it was David who had defeated Goliath way back at the beginning of Saul's reign. And so again the Philistines attack and they enter into the land of Israel, and they're led by this family of Goliath, the giants. David's men are able to defeat 3 sons of Goliath as well as a brother, and finally the Philistines are subdued. And so then finally the curse of Goliath and the family of Goliath, that lamp, is put out. David then, later in the latter part of the book, is incited by the Lord. Now that's an interesting thought, but God allowed it to come into his heart because God sought to use the sin of David for a particular purpose. David was incited to count a census of the people, but not according to the law, out of perhaps trusting in the might of his army and wanting to know the strength of Israel's army because of the battle of the Philistines. He sent Joab to do a count. Well, Joab warned him about this, but David didn't listen. And then he realizes later upon Joab's report that he was trusting in numbers and not in the Lord. And then we're told that God had done this because God was angry with Israel. We're not told exactly what this sin was, but it might be the fact that, they had rejected God's anointed. The Israelites had rejected David, and so he was to punish them. So David was given choices in terms of the punishment for this particular sin. And David did not want to fall into the hands of men, but rather would entrust himself to God, so he chose a plague that would be sent by the Lord for 3 days. As the angel of the Lord of the plague came to Jerusalem, David then appealed to the Lord and prayed and offered himself to bear the punishment, feeling for the people and interceded for them. And here we see David as a type of Christ once again, recognizing his own sin and claiming all of Israel's sin for himself. Well, God accepts that, but he is told that he needs to offer a burnt sacrifice. David then goes upwards on the mountain, the Mount of Zion, where Jerusalem sat, and buys the threshing floor of Araunah. He there offers then upon that threshing floor the sacrifice that God requires, And that place would become the temple site, the site of the new temple, as well as the particular place of the altar of burnt offering. Now, in the midst of all this, we find in chapter 22 David's praise to God for his faithfulness and his forgiveness. And here's what we find, is that the lamp of David is allowed to burn because David is trusting in the Lord and the Lord's forgiveness. He's trusting in God's covenant. And so David says that the Lord is my lamp. Well, that's the light that burns. It's not so much David, although David's house is allowed to remain because of God's faithfulness, but it's because of God's covenant and his forgiveness. And in David's prophecy, he prophesied of the ruler that would come who would rule justly. And of course, that points us to Christ, because our hope, as well as David's hope, is in the promises of Christ and his covenant faithfulness and forgiveness through him. Well, that's good news. Good night.